Welcome to The Check-In, a podcast by Telos where we explore the headlines from Israel-Palestine and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your guest host, Sarah Sturm, filling in for David Kadaba, checking in from Washington, D.C. In today's show, I'm joined by several members of the Telos team to discuss some of the key events we've been following pertaining to Israel-Palestine in the past few weeks. Since January 19th, when the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas went into effect, a lot has continued to unfold on the ground. While for the first time in 15 months, a path out of the horrific violence seems possible, we know it is far from the end of the road towards a sustainable future of peace and justice for Israelis and Palestinians. Our conversation was recorded on Monday, February 10th, and as we collectively hold our breath and hope that the ceasefire holds as we head into the weekend, we know as committed peacemakers it's important to understand the broader context. Since the ceasefire went into effect, we've seen violence expand across the West Bank, a new U.S. administration take power, and laws negatively impacting humanitarian aid take effect. We've also seen Israeli hostages being reunited with their loved ones and Palestinian families across Gaza returning to their destroyed homes. It's been an emotional few weeks that remind us that violence only begets more violence and that another path to peace and mutual flourishing is possible. Join us as we discuss state and settler violence across the West Bank, the current threat to UNRWA, and the actions and implications of the new Trump administration and American rhetoric and power shaping the region. Welcome back, team. Todd, where are you checking in from?
Checking in from my home in Annandale, Virginia.
Ellie, where are you checking in from?
I'm checking in from Jerusalem.
And our fellow for the year, Rebecca, who's on our Farcast for the first time, where are you checking in from?
I'm checking in from Northern Ireland.
Well, welcome, y'all. Really glad you could join us today for this important conversation. As you know, a ton has been happening in the past few weeks ever since the ceasefire was established. And we'll pick apart some of those stories and especially why, as Americans, we should be paying attention and care. So, Todd, I want to start with you. In the past few weeks since the ceasefire, violence across the West Bank has increased, partly due to Israeli military action, but also partly from settlers and settler groups. At the same time, President Trump, shortly after taking office, reversed U.S. sanctions placed on the most violent settlers. Why is this a step in the wrong direction, and what do we mean when we talk about settler violence and why it's a problem?
Well, settler violence is just what it sounds like. It's like these vigilante actions taken by settler groups and organizations and individuals who have deep ideological agendas, many of them very radical because they include, displacement of Palestinians from any place in the land, so in the West Bank. And the bigger challenge in that is that they often act completely with impunity throughout the West Bank. They get to carry out these kinds of acts of violence against Palestinians, from everything from burning fields and cutting down olive trees, burning cars in villages, to attacks on individual Palestinian people. And all this is done often in sight of even like Palestinian Authority police, who have no authority to interact with settlers or to in any way prevent this from happening. And it really does appear to many who are in the West Bank that this all is done also with the at least tacit, if not explicit, cover and support of the Israeli state and military. And so it functions almost as just one more arm of a larger ideological agenda of Palestinian displacement and harassment. And so it's really important that they not be allowed to act with impunity in this way, and that the state hold them accountable, and that outside actors hold the state accountable to hold them accountable. And it was one of the few things the Biden administration did that demonstrated any commitment to trying to bring some kind of sensibility to our relationship there and our policy there in terms of trying to create a more just and peaceful world for Palestinians and Israelis alike, was that they, for the first time ever in the U.S., issued some sanctions against some of these very, known actors who were committing this kind of violence. And it was many of us felt like it was a step in the right direction. And it was one of the first things that the new administration undid when they came in, amongst many other things that they did through executive order, was to pull back all of these sanctions that the Biden administration had put in place against settlers and settler groups that were known to be participating in this really horrific stuff.
Yeah, it also really sends that message, even just symbolically, that this isn't something that the U.S. is trying to stop. And they might not go so far as to say, expand settlements. We support this vigilante violence, as you named it. But symbolism matters, and these reactions matter. And this is absolutely a step in the wrong direction. The other factor that has increased violence across the West Bank has been the expansion of Israeli military action. And Rebecca, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about what's been happening across the West Bank, and especially in areas in the north that have been particularly targeted and devastated, including Jenin and Tulkarem. What's been happening there, and what do we need to know about this?
Yeah, so since January 21st, Israel launched a military operation that it's calling the Iron Wall, which is a reference to its assault on Gaza, which was called the Iron Swords. So far, about 20,000 people have been displaced in Jenin, and another 6,000 in Tulkarem. About 150 to 180 houses have been severely damaged, including in an instance where an entire block of neighborhood houses in Jenin were basically blown up, destroyed to make way for Israeli military vehicles in the narrow streets of the Jenin and Tulkarem refugee camps. This has been claimed to be the operation is being undertaken because the Israeli military is trying to root out what it calls terrorism cells within Jenin and Tulkarem refugee camps, which are places known for militant activity. As the operation has been expanding throughout the West Bank, it's growing into places such as Tubas Governorate and also the Nablus region. Hospitals have been forced to evacuate in both Jenin and Tulkarem. The Doctors Without Borders and the United Nations have stated that 68 West Bank health service points are no longer operational, and hospitals are only running at 70% capacity. There's been reports of civilian deaths as well, including children, the elderly, and a pregnant woman and her fetus who were tragically killed because emergency services could not reach them due to these Israeli blockades in Tulkarem Nur Sham's refugee camp. And it's the same tactics that we've seen being used in Gaza are being used here, such as targeting civilian infrastructure, drone strikes, and civilian casualties. So it's been just a growing tragic situation all around.
Yeah, it's really, really concerning to see that some of the same tactics that contributed to the decimation of Gaza are now being used across the West Bank. And that's something we absolutely need to condemn and push back on. We know that what happened in Gaza didn't move us closer to a future of freedom, dignity, or security for Israelis or Palestinians. It was absolutely a drive in the wrong direction. And so to see it happening now in increased levels of intensity in the West Bank, I'm going to say is both concerning, but also a little bit unprecedented from what we've seen over the past few years. Ellie, can you help us shed some light on what Israeli politicians have been saying to justify this expansion of violence in such extreme ways across the West Bank?
So yeah, just to expand on the last point as well of the expansion of the tactics that were being used in Gaza and into the West Bank, similar rhetoric that was used around Gaza, around the decimation of Gaza, has also been used about the West Bank and specifically Jenin and north of the West Bank. Smotrich, the finance minister, explicitly said that we need to flatten Jenin like we flattened Gaza. And you hear other things like that from up and down the political spectrum, and of course, in the media and otherwise. And that's also in the military. So just for example, the story, Rebecca, you said about the pregnant woman being shot, that is a result of an expansion of the rules of engagement by the new commander of the West Bank region, which basically takes the same rules of engagement from Gaza, which essentially said anyone who approaches a soldier or military installation can be shot on sight, into the West Bank as well. So even though this vehicle that drove towards the Israeli military checkpoint that was set up, slow down and everything, the soldiers, according to these new rules, are able to shoot. So we're seeing an expansion and just both of the tools and tactics of what the Israeli military was doing in Gaza into the West Bank, but also the rhetoric, the very similar idea of this is an opportunity, or what we should be doing is taking over, destroying these areas, pushing the people out, in a very, very similar and horrifying way.
Yeah, really, really concerning, especially because, again, we know that there's no future of peace and justice in the land until there's a future of freedom, dignity, and security for Israelis and Palestinians. And every step we take further from that, the longer the road is towards peace and justice. So thanks so much for that context, Ellie. That's really important to understand as we look at the headlines and see what's happening. Something else that happened recently was that 2 Israeli laws went to effect, banning the operations of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. UNRWA was established back in 1949 by the UN to aid Palestinian refugees who are victims of the Nakba, including their descendants. And Ellie, I'd like to start with you again. Why is crippling UNRWA so problematic, especially given the massive scope of need in Gaza and across the West Bank right now?
This is a major, major development. I think the idea behind it is kind of twofold. One, there's the immediate physical and material impacts of shutting down UNRWA, which is a UN agency that runs schools, medical centers, trainings. It's the largest aid organization in the West Bank and definitely in the Gaza Strip. Most of the aid comes through them. So they're shutting them down is in many ways also intended to deal direct harm to the people who are relying on these services, perhaps as another tool or tactic to push people away, and to try to displace people. And I think there's a long-running ideological opposition to UNRWA within Israel, which tries to say that the Palestinians who became refugees in 1948, the Palestinians who became refugees in 1948, are not actually refugees. This wasn't actually their home, and they shouldn't be allowed to return, the idea of the right of return. So undermining UNRWA is also undermining that connection that Palestinian people have to the land. Obviously, in this very moment, when there's basically the entire population of the Gaza Strip is displaced, is relying on aid, blocking UNRWA from being able to deliver that aid is devastating. The same is true to a lesser extent in the West Bank, but where many, many people, tens of thousands, have been unable to work, have been unable to provide for the families since October 7th. They have relied more and more on those services. Shutting that down will have devastating consequences. And with the shutting down of aid by the United States, shutting down USAID and other streams, so there's less available streams for people who are relying on that aid. So kicking out UNRWA at this moment is devastating. It's in the process of happening. It hasn't happened fully in all the different territories, and it's unclear what will happen as a result of this.
One of the themes that comes up for me so clearly in everything we've been discussing is the dehumanization of Palestinians generally, and not seeing them as people who are equally deserving of access to healthcare, to education, food, safety, a place to safely raise their children, let alone a basic right to life. And I think that that's something worth noting as we look across the board. And I want to turn to you, Todd, to ask you to help us understand the deeper context behind President Trump's recent suggestion to have the U.S. take over Gaza and relocate its people. While I don't want to spend too much time on a suggestion that's patently ridiculous, what I do want to mention it and have us talk about it a little bit is that anytime something so out of touch is said by someone with such influence, is that it normalizes those ideas and beliefs it represents and emboldens others to do the same. And in this case, it's that it's okay to suggest the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. I think this ties into that question from earlier of where does dehumanizing rhetoric make possible these policies that have devastating real-world consequences?
Well, I think that's really, an important thing, Sarah. The administration's plan to displace 2,000 people, which is not a plan yet, it's just an idea has been floated out there to actually displace 2 million people, which can sound crazy, but enough power can behind any bad idea can really wreak a lot of havoc and do something that sounds insane to many people. But what we're seeing, I guess, is that the way in which some in the administration are trying to kind of cast this as a humanitarian response to the massive devastation in Gaza and how, it's obviously a very unsafe place with all the rubble and ruin and unexploded devices. And it is an unsafe situation. And so this kind of attempt to sort of cast it as a humanitarian response to that should also be understood in the fact that it could just be American kind of ignorance and arrogance and kind of bumbling in the world. But it also is very much connected to and consistent with and being celebrated by those who have long had an ideological agenda of Palestinian displacement. And so, there is a movement that has historically existed very much on the fringe of Israeli political and religious thought, which about Palestinian displacement, a Kahanist movement that has always kind of wanted to do something, of this magnitude. And what we're proposing is playing into it's giving support to a very extremist agenda that, again, has always existed very much on the margins, but has now come into more of the center as it has representation in the current Israeli coalition. So I just think we need to understand that, because that is very much predicated on a view of Palestinians that does not respect their dignity, humanity, or any kind of human rights or connection to their home. And I think that has to be really kind of put into the mix on this as the rhetoric, all of this is feeding something that's pretty noxious and horrific, but is not brand new. It didn't come out of nowhere.
I think that's a good point, Todd, that ideologies that we're seeing expand right now didn't come out of nowhere, and that it's really important to have some of that deeper context. And I'd encourage our listeners to also sign up for our newsletter and our Telos Tuesday updates. That's where we go into a little bit more depth on some of the things behind the headlines that are important to know for contextualizing these current moments. Then I'd also encourage you to follow us on social media, where in a little bit more of a real-time way, we're able to offer some context and insight too into some of these updates that have been happening. Todd, I'm wondering because this is a really heavy week, it's a really heavy check-in. I think for all of us who've been paying attention and caring about mutual flourishing for Israelis and Palestinians, it's already been an incredibly heavy 16 months. And even though we now have a ceasefire, right, like the weight has not gone away. Can you land us in a place where you just remind us what global support or mutual flourishing can and should look like? And then also where you're looking right now to see those pockets of hope of people, of our partners acting in ways that show that future is still possible.
I'll be honest, that's a hard question, Sarah. The devastation of Gaza is just such a monumental magnitude that there aren't any easy answers for what to do next. But at minimum, we have to start by being willing to listen to the people of Gaza. It's their home that's been destroyed, and they have to have the lead in saying what happens next. A lot of outside money and power has created this mess, and it will require a lot of outside resources to rebuild. But what has to be off the table is anything that treats the people there as some kind of movable objects on a game board, as the Middle East is kind of quote unquote being remade. This is not a real estate deal. These are human beings with lives and stories and histories and connections. And also we have to appreciate, that, in our own American context, we're very mobile. We move around a lot. We don't have the same connection to home and place, and some of us don't in the way that some people do in other parts of the world. It's such a much more traumatizing thing to think about the idea of not being able to live in where you're from, and and it's a part of the psyche that is, again, much of the world would understand that in a way that Americans don't always understand. But after all we've done to underwrite and support the destruction of Gaza, the least we can do now is to accept some responsibility for that and be a part of a coalition of other countries who in good faith will allow the people of Gaza to return and rebuild and create some kind of functioning and open society out of the ruins of this nightmare. Long before this war, Gazans were not free to travel. They lived under Israeli and Egyptian blockade and Hamas rule for 17 years, and under Israeli occupation before that, and even Egyptian occupation before that. If there's ever to be any peace and security in this part of the world, the people of Gaza have to be allowed to breathe and heal and move around, and ultimately one day to dream again. But, there is this notion that what the president of the United States suggested last week is outside the box thinking, and it's time for outside the box thinking. And I would agree with the fact that it's time for outside the box thinking. It was not being willing to think outside the box of occupation and control and extremist ideologies and that sort of thing that kept us trapped for a long time and has taken us to this place. But the outside the box thinking we need is the kind that respects universal human dignity, and that really does have at its heart this mantra that we say over and over again, that you've used so well and effectively through this whole conversation today, Sarah, is that it has to be something connected to security, dignity, and freedom for everyone, Palestinians and Israelis alike. There can't be two-tiered systems. And all of that has to be done in a way that pushes these ideologies, whether it's the Kahanist kind of stuff we were talking about a minute ago, or the Hamas ideology that imagines, exclusivity in the land and displacement of others. That can never be fully defeated, because you can't defeat an idea, but it can be competed with, and many, many people can be drawn to a better and different way of living in the world if people are willing to boldly lead on that and create space for it. And right now, nobody's offering that kind of compelling vision and program for how we move forward in a way that is connected to mutuality for the people there.
Thanks, Todd. Ellie and Rebecca, I'm wondering if either of you have anything you'd like to add around where you are drawing hope, not as an emotion, but as, the continued call to that kind of committed future that Todd was laying out too, around who we look to in times like this, where it feels overwhelming, where it feels like there's so much bad news and like we've taken 6 steps in the wrong direction. Who are you looking to sustain your energy and your commitment to this work, even in moments where it feels impossible?
I think for me, something even just today that has given me hope is seeing the outpouring of support for the educational bookstore in Jerusalem, which was raided by the Israeli police, and seeing people from across the political spectrum, people, Israelis, Palestinians, internationals, activists, people who just consider themselves lovers of books, seeing them share their stories of that spot in Jerusalem. It's a place of learning and knowledge, and dare I say, peace has been actually wonderful to see that so many people of so many different stripes can all care about the same place and want to see it come back and flourish even better than before.
I love that, Rebecca. That reminder too, that there are pockets of communities where beloved community is the goal, where mutual flourishing is the commitment, and that even as the bigger work in the world continues, we can find those places and communities and the worth protecting, especially when they're under threat, as the educational bookstore is right now. Thank you for that reminder.
Yeah, it's as Todd said, it's a tough question, and it's a tough place to be in, because so many things are so difficult and so bad and going the wrong way. Todd, the vision you laid out is exactly right, of a mutual flourishing, a movement that takes us out of this zero sum that we don't have right now, but is so possible. The potential is just right there. And I think something that I try to remember is if we did this check-in a month ago, imagining a ceasefire would have been unimaginable. And, we called for it and we advocated and we fought. And the fact that we're now in a situation where there is a ceasefire in Gaza, where Israeli hostages are being released, where Palestinian prisoners, political prisoners and otherwise, are being released, but Gaza is being able to be rebuilt. All this is good, is a new reality. And to me, it also underscores the ability and the power of the United States, the administration, the people of the United States, to affect change here, very quickly and very directly and very explicitly. We had war that was active, and for now we don't. And that's obviously fluid and can change, but just the notion that it's possible and it's something that we can keep pushing for and ensuring continues, Todd, like you said, at the very minimum, at the very least, is something that we can push for and try to hold and hope that out of that something better can grow.
What I'm going to say is controversial and will be debated, and I'm okay with that. But I think what in its earliest days, even before inauguration, what the Trump special envoy was willing to do to use American pressure and leverage to bring about that ceasefire has to be acknowledged. I mean, I think they did what the Biden administration refused to do. For most reports will suggest the deal that was accepted was the deal was on the table going back to at least May of last year, that the Biden administration would not use the leverage it had, which may be different leverage than the current administration has, but they still had leverage points and refused to actually exercise them to get it done. And it got done. And all I'm saying about that is what you're saying, Ellie, is right. This was stuck. It wasn't happening. And it finally did. And we couldn't see it happening, and it finally did. It's fragile. It may not hold, but American influence is always going to be important in this until someday in the future when it's not. But as far as things are now, we're still a really key player in this, and we still have to work with whatever power structure we have, whoever's in office and in power, to try to channel our energies in the right way. And we have to pick up on whatever instincts may be there to think outside the box, to try to get that outside the box thinking aligned with these ideas of mutuality. And I think that's a lesson for us also, to not completely lose hope and not be able to see that, we still have things to say, things to do, cards to play, and it can matter, and it can come from unexpected places and sources sometimes too.
Thank you all for answering that admittedly unfairly tough question, especially in this moment. But I think that's what we have to do in these moments, right? Is model for ourselves and others what it looks like to recommit to these deeper values around peace and justice and mutual flourishing in moments where they feel further than ever. I'm reminded of the idea that things that seem inevitable tomorrow often seem unimaginable today. And I think that was true, what Ellie, you were saying around the ceasefire, Todd, what you were saying around change that could be, possible or coming. And it's true that things can change for the worse, but they can also change for the better. So I want to end our time with our listeners today with the quotation I've been thinking of often from Greg's dad, Isa Khalil, to seek peace and pursue it. That is what we must do, even when it feels impossible. And none of us know the small ways that we show up today, how they're going to, ripple out, transform our communities in the world. And that's my invitation to you all as we leave. Stay focused not just on the day-to-day news updates, but on that greater vision, and recommit as a peacemaker to working for mutual flourishing, to not giving into the overwhelm that is so tempting right now, and to keep doing what we all know brings us a better future for everyone. Until next time, take care, and thanks, Rebecca, Todd, and Ellie.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.